and welcome back to 30 Days of Going Inside because you can't go outside. Yesterday was day 22, where we looked at grounding and how to drop anchor when we're feeling a little bit all out at sea. And today we're going to be looking at the word befriend. And this is in relationship to our self-critic, that part of our brain that gives us a running commentary on who we are and how we're doing, and kind of how we undermine ourselves as human beings. And a useful place to start is looking at how our brains respond to stimulus. And this is an exercise devised by Mary Welford that I think can be really effective. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you're really hungry, and I'm going to put up a plate of delicious looking food. And it smells absolutely gorgeous, and it's got ingredients in it that you haven't seen for a couple of weeks, but someone's managed to get their hands on them. And it's a wonderful plate of food. And sitting in front of this wonderful plate of food and really experiencing it with your senses. Kind of the likely impact on your saliva and your stomach juices is that they will increase in volume and consistency, kind of preparing you to eat this wonderful plate of food. And the sight and the sound and the smell of this food actually stimulates a part of our brain called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus prepares you to eat. And then I just want you to imagine for a moment that it's really late and you've come back from a party. This is in the old days, of course. And you're lying there in bed and you're really hungry, and you close your eyes and you bring to the forefront of your mind this delicious, gorgeous plate of food again. And actually what's interesting is that just fantasizing about this plate of food will actually cause your hypothalamus to be stimulated again, and for your saliva and for your stomach juices to prepare yourself for eating. So just the image and the thought of food has this impact on your mind and on your body. And now I want you to imagine that you're meeting up with somebody who you find really, really attractive. And you're having a moment of real connection with them, and they smell absolutely lovely and they really float your boat. And you lean in and you experience something really special with them. You're likely to feel really aroused in this moment. This situation will send a signal to your pituitary gland, which will then release hormones that are associated with arousal. But what if when you get back later, you closed your eyes and imagined and brought to the forefront of your mind that encounter again and thought about that person? Actually, that mental imagery will create exactly the same impact on your body and your mind. So just thinking about that person, just fantasizing about that person will activate your pituitary gland, which will then secrete the chemicals associated with arousal. So the images that you create in your head stimulate your body. Just imagining your dinner actually tickled your hypothalamus, and that actually secreted, changed the volume of your saliva and your stomach acids. And just actually imagining that person that really floats your boat actually is a brain changer, and your pituitary gland secretes those chemicals that are associated with arousal. If you experience bullying in real life, then that will activate your threat system, your fight, flight or freeze, that shallow breathing, that increased heart rate. And actually, when we bully ourselves, we create exactly the same mind and body changes as if somebody was standing over us with a wagging finger, criticizing us and being mean to us. We can get so used to having a running commentary inside our minds about who we are and how we're doing that we can lose sight of the impact that this running commentary has on us as human beings. What are some of the things that we're not doing because our mind tells us that we daren't do them? When we looked at vulnerability, we looked at the shields that we put up to protect ourselves from criticism, not just from others, but from our own self-critical minds. And I'd just like to invite you for a moment to think about if you were interviewing your self-critic and you were sitting opposite them, just to spend a couple of moments, what would be the expression on their face? How big would your self-critic be? What would its posture be like? And when it speaks, what kind of tone does it speak in? Does it remind you of anybody that you know? And kind of, for some people, a self-critic can be a large, menacing and threatening figure. And for others, it can be a small, elf-like gremlin who wags their fingers an awful lot and nitpicks all of the time about how you could be doing stuff better. But actually, we really don't need a self-critic to motivate ourselves. I've noticed in education over the last 15 years how much we steer away now from the concept of self-esteem and over-striving and measuring people on their performances, and instead how we're moving towards self-compassion. Because the reality is the self-critic comes on board really early now in young people, I've noticed. And every time we bully ourselves, we activate that threat system over and over and over again. And this isn't a part of our brain that we want to get rid of entirely, even if we had the power to do so. At the end of the day, I need my self-critic to tell me not to do these videos wearing a bikini. Fundamentally, it is a part of my brain that I need to try and befriend and in some respects empathize with. This is that part of my brain that is just trying to keep me safe at all costs. It means well, but it's clumsy and lacks the language or the insight or the intelligence to give me constructive feedback. Instead, it kind of lives in a world of fear where logic doesn't reside. So when we're in the emotional trenches, which many of you out there at the moment may well be, it's really useful to kind of think about how we might befriend ourselves in those moments of suffering. And we looked a little bit in day 20 at self-compassion and how being kind of sensitive to our distress is really important to be emotionally regulated and to experience that emotional balance. And if we're spending too long in threat state, especially when it's activated by our self-critic, then we can become quite unbalanced. So what we really want to do is to notice our self-critic and to notice it with warmth and to pause when the self-critic is running the show and kind of focus on the feelings that show up in those moments. Because remember, those feelings are the most wonderful opportunity for you to connect with your values and what matters to you. These feelings show up because someone or something really matters to you. Very often our self-critic really rears loud and large when we've experienced failure. And again, how we speak to ourselves in those moments of failure is so key. Failing is kind of how we learn to do things better next time. It's a normal and natural part of how we are as human beings. But our self-critic tends to associate our failures with our shortcomings, and that can really damage our confidence. I love Kristin Neff's work around self-compassion and our self-critic, and she talks about the yin and the yang of self-compassion. The yin being the tender part of how we relate to ourselves, the sort of validating and soothing element around self-compassion. It's okay. I'm here for you. In a moment of suffering, this is a moment of suffering, and it's okay. And kind of the yang is more around the actions that we take. So actions around protecting ourselves, providing for ourselves and seeking to motivate ourselves. So, for example, saying no to things that have stopped being healthy for us. In some respects, the Me Too movement was a collective arising of female yang. So that kind of yang part of self-compassion can be around setting boundaries, motivating us, sort of setting an intent. Because at the end of the day, real change comes from self-love, not from self-loathing. So my invitation to you over the next few days is to notice your self-critic when your self-critic might be running the show, and see if you can turn towards it and seek to befriend it rather than over-identify with it. And in that moment when you notice that your self-critic is there, just to turn towards it with warmth. And kind of, if you can in that moment, say, this is a moment of suffering. What do I need in my life in this moment? Thank you very much for joining me today. And I really look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Take care.